I am excited to discuss this book with you, Secret Teachers of the Western World, which I have to say, um, I read a decent amount of books. I was enthralled by this book. It was like a page turner for me. And I felt as I was reading it that you were hitting so many different points that I stumbled upon in the past and sort of considered to myself, but you were sort of giving it a voice that I wasn't accustomed to. And it sort of took me by surprise in a good way. And I honestly feel that it's very important what you have written, and therefore wanted to sort of mine it with you for a bit and try to draw certain conclusions or possibilities from it. But just to sort of frame it, you're talking about secret wisdom. You're talking about knowledge. Some of it may have been popular at one point, that has had a significant influence on Western culture and the world over, actually, but has been either forgotten, forced underground, shunned, blocked, rejected in some fashion or another. Can you just tell us a little bit about maybe how you got interested in this, one, and also why is it that this information, this knowledge has been suppressed in so many different cultures, do you think?
Well, first off, I want to say thank you very much for having me on the show, and I'm very flattered that you found the book a page turner. I mean, more than anything else, because that's what every writer really wants. They can't put down, thank you. But I mean, well, my interest in the sort of tradition, let's say, that to write about in Secret Teachers of the Western World, which we can broadly call the Hermetic kind of tradition, and that covers a lot of bases. Actually, that started quite some time ago when I was a musician, and I was living in New York, and I was playing in the then unknown band Blondie, later to become, very well known. And I was living with Stein and Debbie Harry in a loft space on the Bowery, just a block or so from CBGB, which was the club where everybody was playing, the Talking Heads, the Ramones, and so on and so on. And I really had no interest in sort of the occult or mysticism or magic, aside from sort of weird fiction, H.P. Lovecraft or old 40s, horror films, things like that. But I didn't take any of it really seriously. I was a reader. I always read quite a lot, but I just wasn't into that. And but in the place we were living in, there was this wild, flamboyant gay biker artist who was into Aleister Crowley. He was, the dark magician, of the last century, and influenced everybody up to the Beatles and so on and so on.
Jimmy Page.
And he's had the tarot deck, and he would do these impromptu tarot readings, and he was painting these sort of canvases, sort of based on some of them. And then the books were around, and then one book that was around was just a book called The Occult. It was by a British writer named Colin Wilson. And it just was such a readable book, as you very kindly said, of my book. I mean, any facility I might have in that came from reading that book first, and then subsequently reading all of Wilson's books. I eventually, met him, and I wrote a book about it, and so on and so on. But I just became enthralled, because it wasn't just horror stories or ghost stories. He was looking at it actually philosophically, but he was a very, very good writer. They just crackled with ideas. And I was about 19, so I was, very impressionable. And so that's when it started. And how I came to write this particular one many years later. I'd already written a few books for my editor at the time, was Mitch Horowitz at Turcher Penguin, and a biography of Rudolf Steiner and I think Swedenborg and some others. And then I had, well, I mean, this particular book, I look at this whole tradition, which, depending how you want to look at it, where its roots are, I mean, but the sort of visible roots go back to sort of the early Christian era in sort of Greco Roman Egypt, Alexandria, and this is, we have like the rise of the Hermetics and the Gnostics and Neoplatonism and a variety of other more mystical, for sake of a better word, kind of philosophies and views of the world. And it actually, that tradition had a certain prestige for a great many centuries in Western culture, but it fell foul of the rise of what we consider to be sort of science in the early 17th century. But it never went away. Right. And it always remained, in popular forms like, the astrology column in the newspaper, but also in serious kind of pursuit. And what I did with this particular book was that I had read a book called The Master and His Emissary, which is by Ian McGilchrist, who's a neuroscientist and an English professor as well. To try and do it short, he rebooted the whole sort of left brain, right brain kind of dialectic, which had, people weren't dealing with it because it had become kind of too popular with pop science and things of that sort. But he realized there really was something there, but it wasn't so much what the two brains do as how they did things. And make it simple. The left brain is very analytical and sequential and logical, and it breaks things down into bits and pieces that it can manipulate. And it's sort of, necessary. This was sort of in order to deal with the world. It's a sort of brain that deals with the world and has this remarkable ability to focus with this laser-like precision and accuracy. But it does that at the expense of losing the connection to everything else. And according to McGilchrist, the right brain presents a kind of whole, a kind of total gestalt of the given. And it's much more living, and it isn't about dealing with things. It's just being. So, I mean, I make it simple. I bring this simple formula. If the left brain is about taking care of business, the right brain is about taking care of isness.
That's good.
Istigkeit, nice Eckhart talks. And so, and I look at the Western esoteric Hermetic tradition as a kind of tradition of a kind of right brain knowledge. And one of the things that McGilchrist says that in the last few centuries, this kind of creative balance, a kind of system of checks and balances between the two brains has got a bit askew because the left brain has been gaining more and more control. And what it likes to do more than anything else is recreate everything around it as something it knows already. So it breaks everything down into, some kind of very familiar picture, and it excludes anything that doesn't, go with that or add to that. And so McGilchrist's argument is that the left brain, in a way, has usurped its position, because it was created. It's the emissary that's taken power away from the master, and the right brain is historically older. And I mean, I'm narrowing it down very simple, the story, but it sort of created the left brain as a helper in order to unpack this total picture. There's the beingness is there, and then it's all there, and left brain is this kind of like the focus. It's kind of like a magnifying glass in a way, in order to, okay, how do I unpack all this? And I have to survive as well. Henri Bergson, a French philosopher of the last century, said, the brain is the organ of attention to life. Right. It's, we have to deal with things. So any case, so that's sort of the motor or the thematic narrative of, okay, so can we understand this other tradition, which, if indeed, as McGilchrist says, the left brain has usurped power and become dominant, it did historically, to me, I say it seems when, the early 17th century, this tradition suffered a complete loss of kind of prestige under kind of strange enough, combined attack by this rising natural philosophy, science, and all that, and the church at the time. They kind of joined forces to eliminate, this other rival. So, in any case, that's sort of the theme, and I kind of tell its history,
So that opens up such a can of worms. Like, there are so many important questions, it seems to me, just based on what you're outlining in terms of what Dr. McGilchrist is talking about. So let me see if I can ask a couple of clarifying questions. First of all, the notion of one part of the brain being older than another and somehow fusing together, and I know there's a third part of the brain that's considered even older. I don't know that there's any specific evidence for that. I mean, ostensibly there is, but it's a funny idea that somehow these almost two separate organs got fused together in one small spot, and so and know how to interface. It's almost like personifying the brains. And the way you describe it in the book, it's almost like the left brain made a deliberate assault on the right brain, consciously, to reduce or usurp its power, which also strikes me as wild, a wild idea to consider. However, at the same time, it seems patently obvious that the left brain is utterly dominant in our current society, to our detriment. And I've been advocating for a long time, and this is all outlined in, I'm sure in Sephirotic thought in Kabbalah, which is what I'm interested in mostly. And there is a right brain sort of energy, and there's a left brain sort of energy, and there's a fusion of those two, which is considered balanced, right? And so I've been trying to advocate. I didn't realize I was advocating Gnosticism on level. I was advocating that people get in touch with their rightness, whether it's right-brainedness or this sphera of chesed, to get in touch with the broader picture and scope of what the world actually is, and not having it being so filtered out by the left brain and its analysis, as important as that can be. But so I just threw out a couple of things, but age of the brain, the assault of the left brain, being out of balance. What can you say about those things?
Well, I mean, one of the things that struck me that lines that sort of narrative up, and I mean, even McGilchrist says in The Master and Emissary that it does sound like, there's intent behind, I mean, perhaps, I mean, the identity, I mean, our I-ness, the what we recognize as I or me, is more or less housed in the left brain, because left brain is one that deals with language and that sort of thing. And next door, we have a neighbor who's strangely enough also ourselves, but not ourselves, or we are it in some way, whom we, know to some degree, but, don't know very, very well. But I mean, I think, Paul MacLean, this was something that Arthur Koestler wrote about. I mean, he's, voiced in the past, but with the sort of triune brain, you have the sort of the reptilian and then the mammalian and then the, the cerebral cortex and all that. And then other people talk about the cerebellum, this kind of first dry run for a kind of, cerebrum. And then it somehow, the thing about Koestler, the interesting thing he says is that, you look at sort of, evolution, he says there's all these dead ends, where, okay, we tried that, that didn't go anywhere. So there's no reason to, it may not necessarily be the case, but there's no reason to think it's impossible that, as you just said, there's this kind of growth, sort of thing that's there, and then something else grows. But the other thing I was going to say that sort of fused it for me with this tradition is something, the Gnostic tradition that you mentioned, where the whole idea of this false god, demiurge, there's the true God is the creator. Well, he's not he's the, he wants to create a world for some reason or other, but he doesn't do a job himself. He hires out, he doesn't get his hands dirty. He hires out. So he creates this demigod or demiurge to do the work, the architect. And he gets carried away with his work, and he starts to identify with it, and he's the real one. So that's the left brain. You can see the same sort of thing, and the archons and all of that. And so, and you mentioned, Kabbalah, you have the pillar of mercy and the pillar of severity, and then there's in the middle. And I mean, they're very broad, general sorts of things, but you can see in these kind of traditions, and I tend to think, well, or, can we see these as sort of intuitions of this sort of thing? At the same time, I think, it could turn out to be, whether it's in the brain or not, there are these differences in modes of knowing, the world in this sort of tightly focused or logical or dealing with things. And then we all know the difference between having to deal with things all the time. And then, unfortunately, we have to, certain substances help us to sort of get out of that. And, suddenly you have the strange phenomenon of something that before was nothing. It just was something, whatever it was in front of you, then it looks interesting. It's interesting because you've somehow managed to get out of that dealing with the world mode, and you're letting, the being of whatever it is around you, more of it, and somehow in some sort of way. I mean, we don't know how to turn it on or off, although I guess some modes of meditation sort of aim at doing that. We sort of have devised ways of doing it in some way. So, it struck me that, oh God, this looks like a good, sort of parallel. And you can see throughout the history of these different people that I talk about as secret teachers, there is this kind of dialectic, and many of them tried to have a balance of the two. So you have the scientists, and you have sort of the mystic, and then there's these ones who somehow, Pythagoras and others like that, who try to bring both sides together, which is the ideal.
So I think a lot of people think of him as just the guy who discovered things about angles and triangles. But as you outline, he had quite a lot to say in terms of mysticism, and he had a whole discipline for his life and his followers. When you call somebody a secret teacher, how do you get into that club? And why is he in it? Why is Plato in it? And others that you outline in the book?
Well, there's a couple different ways you can look at that sort of phrase. Secret teacher. It's a teacher that we don't know about, or is unknown, or isn't known as well. So, people their reputation, doesn't allow for their, full influence to be known. So, say someone like Madame Blavatsky. If anyone knows about her, this crazy Russian woman who, claimed to have traveled through Tibet and been taught by Hindu masters there, and sent into the West to battle against materialism, rising materialism, blah, 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 blah. And, she's supposed to be shown to be a fraud and all this kind of stuff. And when I wrote my book about her, I was surprised, because I accepted like, a lovable rogue, at best. But then I learned, actually, so many of the things have, if you trace them to their sources, and they're actually not. They're inaccurate, or they're, misinterpreted. And
the rogueness is inaccurate?
No, not that. But I mean, these sorts of things. I mean, I don't want to go into details about her in particular. But I mean, but one of the things that hardly ever gets mentioned is that, she introduced Gandhi to the Bhagavad Gita. So, you hear stuff about her supposedly being responsible for the Nazis because of stuff she said about root races and all this sort of thing. But when, in her last days, when she was living in London, not too far from where I live, and Mahatma Gandhi was in London studying law, and wearing a bowler hat. And I always, when I say this in talks, he's saying, doing his best to be Ben Kingsley. And these two theosophists who were gaga over anything Indian or Hindu or anything like that. They just bumped into him, and they just said, "Oh, we're very interested." And at some point, they said, "Wouldn't it be wonderful? All three of us could read the Bhagavad Gita in the original language." And he had to admit that he had never read it in any language, because the Christian missionaries had told him it was rubbish. And they said, "Well, you must meet Madame Blavatsky." And they took him to Avenue Road. I said not far from where I live, where she was living. And, that's when he met. And after that, he always had a good word, even his last days, the day he was assassinated. In the journal they put out, he, spoke about theosophy as Hinduism in theory and Hinduism as theosophy in practice, or something along those lines. So, I mean, this is sort of thing. So, I mean, she was influential in that kind of way. And there's other ways, and where this different figures, or the ideas from this tradition have informed what we know as culture. Or you are a teacher of secrets. That's the more esoteric sort of way of looking at it. There's a knowledge that you have that you can pass on to others, and that's the whole sort of Hermetic chain. This golden chain of the adepts, where Hermes Trismegistus teaches Asclepius, and Asclepius teaches someone else, and someone else teaches Pythagoras, and he teaches Empedocles, and goes out to Plato, and so on and so on. That kind of mystical chain of the great adepts, and so that's one idea. So it's a different way of looking at it, and I mean that what I wanted to do is exactly what you said. I wanted to write a kind of epic narrative, right. A narrative history, which again, that's a kind of form of writing that's not as prevalent. Certainly not the academic world, but I wanted to write a page-turning narrative because it's an exciting story.
It really is, and I'm particularly interested in the advantages of let's call it again right brain kind of thinking. Although in my subjective thinking, I don't think it's necessarily about the brain per se, but rather what's behind the brain. Which is a different sort of discussion. But be that as it may, you talk about the concept of perspective in art. Are you familiar with the work of Bernardo Kastrup at all? Does that name sound familiar?
I know who he is, yes. I can't say I'm familiar with his work.
It's excellent. I also think very important. And he also talks about perspective in one of his books. And he wanted to make the case that the reason that things were two-dimensional in art at a certain time and then became three-dimensional was not some discovery of painting techniques, but rather because humans simply perceived the world differently. And as science progressed and people wanted accuracy in their representation of the world, three-dimensionality was sort of born. And how do you understand how culture, music, and art of all kinds has been affected by what you call the aggressiveness of the left brain?
Well, I mean, I just want to say we were just talking about their perspective, because someone else whose ideas I draw on to kind of push the narrative along with the Gilchrists, because they do line up in many ways, is this German-Swiss philosopher Jean Gebser, who died in 1973, but he wrote this remarkable book called The Ever-Present Origin. He doesn't talk about the brain so much as he talks about what he calls structures of consciousness. Different sort of forms of consciousness that have emerged over time, and there's 5 of them. And we ourselves are in the last stages of what he calls the mental rational structure of consciousness, and we're experiencing its breakdown. It's starting to take itself apart, and possible preparation for the what he calls the integral stage, which will somehow recapitulate all these previous stages. It's the archaic, the magical, the mythical, the mental rational, and then so. I mean, that's his kind of. But how he describes this breakdown or the kind of hypertrophying of because the mental rational structure lines up very well with how McGilchrist describes the excesses of the left brain. So they seemed in some way talking about something similar. But he talks about perspective starting with Petrarch's Ascent of Mont Ventoux, in the 14th century when the Italian poet Petrarch, he decides to climb a mountain, and apparently he's one of the first or few, whatever, I don't know, maybe somebody was before him, but he's the one we know about the most who ever decided to climb a mountain just to see the view. People have gone over mountains because they had to, and but and on the way he meets different people, and they say, "Oh no, why are you going there? You will only die, or there's only demons there. So I hope there be monsters." Different versions of that, and he's driven to go, and it's a wonder. He writes a letter to his confessor about it all, because he's a very good Christian. And a good Catholic, and the whole idea of being awed by the marvels of the world seems a bit satanic, or whatever. He shouldn't really that, but at the same time he climbs and he sees these vistas, and Gebser, and also this other interesting fellow who is I would say a secret teacher because nobody knows about. I mean, Gebser is a secret teacher. Not too many people know about him. This fellow named Owen Barfield, who was good friends with C.S. Lewis, and he was part of this group called the Inklings. He used to meet in Oxford, and it was Lewis and Tolkien, and Charles Williams was another one. But Barfield, but he wrote about the history of language as giving evidence for a kind of archaeology of consciousness, or sort of evolution of consciousness. And he too said that prior to this time, it was sort of like the Middle Ages. Everything was like a tapestry. He didn't have that much that sense of depth that much, and so you have things were big that were important, religiously important. They had a kind of so it wasn't perspective, and then suddenly it was like this is much more rooted in in the world and things of that sort. So there was a shift there, and this is Gebser said this is sort of the beginning of the space age, in the sense that human conscious, at least in the West, I mean, the human consciousness starts to get much more aware of just the sheer distance of things, and he's having like this incredible mystical experience, but he's also feeling a bit like, oh, maybe I shouldn't be enjoying this kind of thing at the same time.
So interesting. Another thing I wanted to ask you about is you talk about people doing those like idiot savants who do these calculations instantaneously, pi to whatever degree, and prime numbers, up until okay. And from what I understand, as you were explaining it, that it's not possible to just calculate that there are supercomputers that it takes some time to be able to do that, and you describe it as sort of like a seeing, or just like a knowing that this is the number, which I found fascinating, and it opens again questions about the nature of genius and the nature of knowledge, and I think the reason you start to explain also ancient cultures and certain technologies that they had that surprise us nowadays is to suggest that there was something about, let's call it again, the right brain consciousness, that people were able to access for different kinds of information, that we can't understand how they could have had, because we have no ability to do what they did. Is that an accurate description of that whole concept?
Well, I mean, I think I think we can look at it that way. I mean, some people have directly sort of linked what we would call sort of a more right brain sort of perception of things with ancient civilizations like Egypt. There is a French alchemist and sort of renegade Egyptologist, René Schwaller de Lubitsch, who spent many years in Luxor, and he talked about this kind of symbolique, which was this kind of way of perceiving things where you saw, their actual physicalness, but somehow you participated with it in a deeper kind of sense. I mean, we tend to see everything outside of us as outside. It's like we're in a box with lots of other things, and it's like we bump into all the other stuff. But in this other mode, you kind of blend in with the things in different ways, and you participate with them. And this wonderful book you wrote, one of the last things you did, called Nature Word, And it's all these aphorisms or short sort of passages about this sort of participatory kind of consciousness. And I mean, people like Barfield, and also a straight, Germanist academic, a fellow named Eric Keller, who wrote much about Thomas Mann and Nietzsche and Rilke and all this. But they both start talking about this whole notion that, the further you go back in language itself is more poetic.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say more metaphoric. You never reach this kind of grunt, like, bare fact, kind of nuts and bolts kind of language, which one, from the Darwinian kind of perspective, you would think you have to start out with simple kind of things and it gets more complex. But the language itself, the further you go back, it has this kind of luster,
Mm-hmm.
of kind of imagery and poetry. And as you were saying, people saw the world in a different way. And this is what they're saying. Yes, back then, it wasn't this kind of sharp differentiation between, inner and outer, the Cartesian, there's a little puddle of consciousness in here, and then there's this, hard world out there somehow. I think we do experience those sorts of participatory moments, meditation, in religious experiences and aesthetic experiences, or listening to music.
Yes.
But we just think of them as being relaxed or something. It's like, it's kind of, oh, well, you know what I mean? It's the kind of a little icing on the cake, as it were.
Right. Which I think it's something much deeper than that. Personally,
Mm.
it's not just that it's putting you in a good mood, and therefore you're experiencing pleasure. I mean, I've asked this to many people, but you're a very appropriate person to ask this to as a, Hall of Fame inductee musician. It seems to me that there is no evolutionary benefit to listening to music. All it is some tones. There's no actual meaning to them. And yet we all know, or most people know, that you can have something akin to a transcendental experience participating in a musical experience, especially at a club or a stadium, or like where a lot of people are doing it at the same time. To me, that's a very right brain, mystical encounter, whether or not we label it that way. But and furthermore, my experience in observing myself and others going through that kind of experience is that there's a goodness attached to it. There's a fundamental goodness attached to it, where I know maybe at CBGB's people might mosh or beat each other up or something, but in most concerts, people have a sense of unity, they have a sense of harmony, they have a sense of sort of loving each other, being in this experience together. And I think that kind of experience is so critical for our culture in so many different ways. Like politics to me seems left-brained and is divisive, and art seems right-brained and therefore it seems unitive. And so I think part of the sickness that I would say our culture is experiencing and getting worse and worse possibly is part of this dichotomy that people have not had or not having enough nourishment from the right side, and they're acting out in upset and anger, at sort of being spiritually malnourished, I would call it. I mean, how would you react to that?
Oh, I think that's a very accurate assessment of things. There always are ways to access this, but it's not been kind of, how should we say it, integrated into the culture, except in those sorts of ways. So you can go get out of it, out of Dionysian, rave up and all that sort of thing. And that's where it happens. But you're right. It's one of the things I think, and I've written about this in, I think I touched on it towards the end of the book, but I've written about it in a couple other books of mine. One called Lost Knowledge of the Imagination, and then in another, Speak of the Devil, called Dark Star Rising, which was about Trump. And but the whole idea is that it strikes me in some ways, because we haven't integrated in some ways this other mode, and it doesn't go away. It's just, just like Freud and the repressed, Return of the Repressed, or whatever it is, or Jung in the Shadow. It's not there. I mean, it's not that it's not there. We might not want to see it, but it's there. It's still with us, and it will emerge in ways, less salubrious sometimes. And I think, in recent times, the in various different ways, the kind of irrationalism, that's not necessarily, as we say, channeled through traditions. It's just, but that's not, as I said, I wouldn't say the traditions are irrational. They're in addition to, but you know what I'm saying. But it comes out in this raw sort of other ways. So all the kind of very strange QAnon and variety of different conspiracy kinds of things and all that. I mean, I tend to think of that's where the far out meets the far right. In those that weird kind of penumbra of conspiracy theories and a variety of other things, and you do find many new agey or spiritual, whatever you want to say, people breaking bread with sensibilities that we would think, oh, you wouldn't necessarily normally find yourself, together, but in some way. So, I mean, that's one of the things that I think has been, happening in the past, several years.
Me too. And it's fascinating to observe. And I'll just say one more thing. Unfortunately, I'm almost out of time already, and I just started warming up in terms of what I wanted to ask you. But there's a TED Talk. I think it's the most popular TED Talk ever, which is called My Stroke of Insight by Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor, who's a woman who had an unusual kind of stroke that shut off her left brain only. And so she was and she's a brain researcher to boot, which is fascinating. But so she's one of the few people in the world who experienced life through only the channel of her right brain. And the way she describes it is, almost like a psychedelic, blissful, joy-filled experience, that she almost, didn't want to end, except that she was sort of aware that she might die if she didn't get help. But she said she was thoroughly enjoying it as it was happening. And so to me, that just underscores everything we've been discussing, which is there is some latent power that human beings have. We've been detached from it over time, maybe by accident, maybe by design. But it is still available in various forms. And I think that to the degree that we can develop this as people and as a culture, I think we would reap so many great benefits. And I hope that your work and books like this one, and now I'm motivated to read your others, can really contribute to people understanding that there's a long and rich history of these ideas. It's not like, it's not just like the National Enquirer and some hooey stuff. It's that it's worth looking at.
I'm sorry. I was say the thing I always say, I think is like you sort of somehow have to get past the woo woo factor.
Yes.
You used to not to be able to talk about sex,
Right.
It was like nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Now you can talk about sex and it's utterly boring, but you can say whatever you want about it. So the woo-woo is still here with this. And that to me, in one sense, although it's a hurdle, it also suggests that it suggests its potential because it's still seen as dangerous in some way.
Right.
And even with all the Harry Potters, that's all out there too, but it's a kind, I don't know. It has a visible, it's visible in the popular culture, but as I said, in terms of being actually integrated in, what we take to be, knowledge of ourselves, it's still on the fringe. Thank you very much. I very much appreciate talking about the book again, and I hope we have another conversation sometime.
Me too. Can I ask you one real fast question? What's Debbie Harry like?
I knew her a long time ago. She was a good cook. And she ironed my skinny ties for me. So she was very nice.
Okay. Well, thank you for your contribution there too. Blondie's been with me my whole life as well. And Ex-Offender, great song.
Thank you.
And anyway, it was a real pleasure to speak to you, and I appreciate your time. And we'll please go and check out this book and all of Dr. Lachman's work. And we will be back next time with more ideas, more things to consider. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and go to beyondbelief.blog and register and check out all the things that we have coming up. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Have a great day.
Take care. Bye-bye.